This podcast is intended for a mature audience and might be offensive or triggering for some listeners. If you struggle with persistent feelings of fear, sadness, anger, or anxiety, I urge you to confront those feelings with the guidance of a trained trauma-focused therapist. And if at any time you experience intrusive thoughts of hurting yourself or others, call 911 or a local crisis hotline immediately. Welcome back to the madness of the Midnight Sun. Today, Dr. Nathaniel Harnett returns to expand on the science behind trauma. Dr. Harnett is director of the Neurobiology of Affective and Traumatic Experiences Laboratory at McLean Hospital and an assistant professor in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. His research is focused on understanding the neurobiological mechanisms that mediate susceptibility to trauma and stress-related disorders. I'm grateful to bring his insights onto the show as I muse ghosts that may haunt the traumatized mind.
So Nate, you said you've checked out some of the episodes. What were your general impressions, and why is this important enough to give it some time? I know you're really busy.
Like, the first thing I would say is that part of our job as scientists and as people interested in trauma science is that we really do need to be giving back to people. And we've spent all this time doing all this research, and that if there's any way that we can help sort of get the word out in the same way that you are, I think that's a partnership that just sort of has to happen, right? We need to be able to get information on ACEs, on childhood trauma, on the sort of long-term deleterious impacts of these experiences out to the rest of the world, so that we can all come together and find ways to sort of boost resilience or boost recovery, or find a way, even God forbid, to prevent some of these impacts from happening, right? The other thing is that your series looks really cool, man. It's really got a really cool sort of both very informed but also grungy kind of feel. And I haven't seen that in years, and I'm just oh man, this takes me back to helping my old film friends with their old weird sort of horror movies and being what the hell are we doing? It was very cool. It's very nostalgic in a lot of ways.
Hi, I'm Monster Jack. I'm here because you're scared, and we need to talk about why. Hell, I'm scared too. We've been at this a long time, both the work as well as the avoidance. I've been avoiding looking at the neurological science behind trauma a long time. It was maybe safer to blame it all on an external entity like a ghost, because even entertaining the idea that those demons are actually a part of the mind is scary. How can you escape a monster that exists within your brain? But after years of working on this, I've come to terms that the only honest way to explore my ghost story is to look at it from all sides. And while I don't completely discount all the experiences I had with that haunting growing up, the impacts of trauma certainly did possess me at different pivotal times in my life. So, Nate, how did you get interested in studying neuroscience?
I was just so fascinated by this idea that everything that we have been, everything we are, and everything we will be is really just wrapped up here, right? Everything we know about who we are and about the world is just in this small little space in between our skull. It is so fascinating to think about all my experiences, all the experiences I would have, my friends' experiences. If we could just understand that, we could understand why people are the way they are. I think the more honest and real answer is that a lot of people who do psychological research do a little bit of me search. We try to understand why are we as fucked up as we are is often the question that we're trying to ask and answer. I have my own emotion regulation difficulties at times. I live in Boston now, so I don't know if you've ever driven in Boston, but driving in Boston is one of the most rage-inducing things. And every time it happens, I'm man, I got to figure out what's going on in my brain that's really messing up my emotion regulation. What is that actually?
Yeah, and and that stress, yeah, it does impact. I mean, like, it can be activating, and life can be so busy that way, no matter where you live, whether it's, your daily grind in that traffic or just the
Yeah.
pressures you have, to make ends meet. I mean, I think it's really important that we look at, yeah, like what is that doing to us on a, day to day? And then, what can we do to kind of, hey, chill out in healthy ways, right? And learn to recognize when we need to actively practice stabilizing that because it bleeds over, right? Like a virus, like, I mean, to other people even, right? Like how, I don't know, it is interesting to me.
So for me, it's really about, how do we understand this thing that is us in a very sort of basic biological way? And then how do we understand our sort of emotional connection to it? How do we understand the way in which we sort of swim through the waters of life, to wax poetical about it? And like, how does our own stress, our own childhoods impact the way that we interact with the world around us? And for us, we really think it's something to do with this thing up here. And if we could just understand that in a really nuanced and critical and sort of deep way, we might be able to help prevent some of the other sort of emotional disorders that we think about, like PTSD, like depression, like anxiety, from impacting other people down the line.
I received a diagnosis of complex PTSD, and I'm aware that that's not in the DSM yet. But for me, what makes it sort of different than PTSD is that I got used to kind of always having sort of semi-traumatic things going on and kind of being in a state of hypervigilance and preparedness for that.
I think it's important to note that it's very true that complex PTSD isn't recognized within the DSM, but the DSM is not the only classification system for mental health disorders, right? The International Classification of Disease from the World Health Organization does recognize complex PTSD. It recognizes complex PTSD and it recognizes it separate from PTSD. If you go on for the US, the National Center for PTSD, which is part of the Veterans Affairs website, you'll note that they also talk about complex PTSD. And part of the reason that complex PTSD isn't in the DSM-5 is because it's encapsulated by the diagnostic criteria of PTSD. So it's not that complex PTSD isn't real. It's that it doesn't have, for whatever reason, an official diagnosis for the US system, but it doesn't change the fact that individuals do experience it. And we can argue, and I think that clinicians of different, I don't want to call them faiths, but different ideologies argue about whether or not it should be called one thing or another. This gets into this weird sort of like tautological argument about taxonomy in psychiatry, where we've come up with these silly little labels to call things different things, and then we argue about what those labels should be as opposed to what individuals are actually experiencing. And so I think that if you're experiencing things that are complex PTSD, that's the thing that needs to be treated, not just find whether or not, is it the dissociative subtype of PTSD? Is it PTSD version 24-AB? Like that part doesn't really matter from my perspective as a neuroscientist, not a clinician.
For me, it's weird, like that when things are actually going well, and even like looking forward to this meeting and being so excited. I'm so excited. I'm so grateful to have you here. But then leading up to it, I'm getting really anxious, and I'm confident that we're going to have a great conversation. I feel really good about our initial call and the connection I felt like we fostered there in talking about this. Yeah. But that's what was triggering for me, because it goes like, oh man, anytime something feels safe and good, that means something bad is going to happen because it always did, and I hate that. I just want to be happy sometimes when I feel like, this is a good thing and I should feel happy like everyone else when they have good things happen. What's going on in my brain, Nate? You know what I mean? That's I guess that leads me to my question of, when someone experiences trauma from a neuroscience perspective, what is going on internally in the brain? Like how is that wiring somebody when, let's start with just a singular major traumatic event. What are you guys finding? What's going on up there?
I think it's important for me, from my perspective, the way I would frame our understanding of the brain and trauma is that the brain really exists to keep us alive. Its core function is to help us go through the 4 Fs, right? Fighting, fleeing, feeding, mating. You can guess why it's the 4 Fs as opposed to just mating. But when any of those different processes are in jeopardy, the brain uses different adaptive mechanisms to try to maintain your ability to survive and do those different things. When we encounter something stressful, something threatening, that's a potential dangerous situation that we have to either avoid or confront so that we can go back to having our basic needs met and so that we can survive. One of the ways that we think about trauma is in this view of sort of fear or threat learning. I think people have probably heard of Pavlov's dog. If you ring a bell and then you give a dog some food, it learns that the bell predicts the food and it has this salivary response. And we would call that sort of appetitive or reward related learning. So they're learning that once you get the cue, you get this pleasant outcome. In fear learning, individuals learn that when they get a cue, they're going to get an aversive outcome and they have to enact a defensive behavior. So if I play a light or a tone and then I shock you, you're probably going to learn relatively quickly that that light or tone predicts that something bad's going to happen and you need to get yourself ready to go. The question then becomes what happens once that aversive stimulus is taken away. People typically go through what we call extinction learning. You play the light, you play the tone, they don't get the bad thing that happens, and they start to calm down. When we're talking about trauma, when we're talking about things that are so aversive, so threatening to your basic survival that you need to get that learning right, there are a couple things that might be happening. On the one hand, it might be the case that that light or tone isn't quite there all the time, right? It might be that when a light happens, you get that averse event, or it might not happen. And so if you don't have something that's reliably predictive of this very aversive traumatic event, let's say in the case of, say, adverse childhood experiences like witnessing abuse, you look for other things that are going to help tell you whether or not you're in that potential dangerous situation. Maybe you start looking or listening for specific audio cues like floorboards creaking. And if you're in a house that's kind of drafty, those floorboards creak all the time. You're constantly activated because of that. You're generalizing this association, this cue threat association, to things that might be relatively innocuous. Or you might start looking at the general context, the general environment that you're in. You might start to think, well, if I'm in this environment, I'm likely to get this threat. So you start to have this preparatory response during that environment. And that way, it starts to become that nothing's really safe anymore. The environments that you start to exist in, if those are the places where you experience that trauma, experience that threat, that sense of safety that you're sort of describing can't really form anymore. And you're constantly in this sort of defensive, engaged, ready to respond state. And it makes perfect sense, right? If you are in an environment that's dangerous, you need to be able to respond because you need to be able to survive. It's completely adaptive. It makes a lot of sense. The issue, of course, as you know, and I think as many other people know, is what happens when you shouldn't be expecting danger anymore, when you should be considering yourself in a safe situation. And how do you get people back to feeling like, okay, yes, this thing happened, but it's past now, or I'm not in that dangerous situation, and I can start to have sort of a lower emotional response. And there are different sort of brain circuits that we can talk about that sort of get activated. People often talk about, the hippocampus or amygdala. And there's a complex interplay between these sort of regions that promote that sort of cue threat associative learning, like the amygdala, information about the context that we live in that's supported by the hippocampus, and these sort of prefrontal mechanisms that help to either exacerbate when it's appropriate or dampen that emotional response mediated by these brain regions.
Okay. And so that's not always a conscious thing that's happening though, right? It could be very subconscious. Like say, for example, like going back to the bell, right? That cue, right? So if you grew up in a household where one of your caregivers was an alcoholic, for example, and you learned that anytime you heard that clinking of ice in the glass or you smelt that little whiff of alcohol, well, it was more likely that your caregivers were going to fight, or worse, something else, abusive was going to happen. Well, that could become that bell, right? And so anytime, you smell alcohol, let's say you go to the nurse's office because you got a scraped knee and that nurse takes out some alcohol to swab it. Well, now, smelling that alcohol might make you kind of feel nervous or start to have some reactions, but you're not necessarily going, well, it's because my parent drinks. You know what I mean? It's not
Yeah.
necessarily a conscious thing, probably most of the time. Would you agree?
Yeah, I definitely think that this is something that's very individual specific. I think some people can put the label, the conscious label of like, oh, this is the reason that I do this. But fear learning, any type of associative learning is partially automatic. It's partially non-conscious processing. We do it to keep ourselves alive. And so you can definitely imagine situations where, and this is part of, I think, a lot of the issue in psychotherapy is trying to get people to understand why these behaviors exist, because they become so automatic, they become so non-conscious. Even if you did think about it consciously at one point, it's very efficient to not have to think about it every time. And again, going back to adaptability, going back to survivability, if you need to put your energy, your mental energy into thinking about other things, it makes perfect sense to start taking automatic triggers and thinking, not having to think rather about what might be associated with that. So yeah, I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense there.
And so then, that's where I think, right, probably like counseling and things like come in, like, because if you can find a way to identify these triggers, right, I think that helps, like, that it's that automatic response that I personally feel like can become so overwhelming and kind of take control, because you're not really necessarily aware of the puppet master that's pulling those strings, at least in my experience, right? Why am I feeling so stressed and high strung right now? I don't know, but if I was more familiar with my triggers, if I was more familiar with kind of my wiring, I might go, oh, hey, Levi, this is classic CPTSD. You're fine, and I can give myself those affirmations, and just by doing that, it curves some of it. But if you don't have that awareness, I mean, it's sad. I mean, because you're really at the mercy of those responses, I think.
Yeah. For me, part of the drive has been trying to understand what are my own sort of trauma triggers? What are the things that have led me to be sort of the way that I am? And I think it's taken a lot of time to try to understand just how, at a very fundamental, basic biology level, general stress, acute stress, chronic stress, and even traumatic stress can all sort of what really looks to be rewire and reframe the way your brain works, the way your brain processes information to try to ultimately keep you safe. I think that's a really fascinating part about what our brains do, is I think a lot of people think about psychiatric disorders and PTSD and trauma as you're just sort of maladaptively responding to things. And that's not really true. Like, the point of PTSD, the point of most of our psychiatric disorders is to do something to keep you safe, is to maintain your homeostatic balance. PTSD is bad when you come back from war or after a traumatic event is over, because there's nothing else to be concerned about. Because at that point, it's interfering with your ability to do the basic things that you need to do. It's interfering with your ability to get in a car. It's interfering with your ability to go to work, to maintain stable relationships. Those are the parts that are maladaptive. But if you actually are in a traumatic situation, if you are in an environment where there are a lot of ACEs day to day to day, if you're living in a community where around the next corner there might be violence, it makes perfect sense to be hypervigilant. It makes perfect sense to be jumpy or easily startled. It makes perfect sense to engage in avoidance behaviors and to have these like memories pop into your head to remind you, oh yeah, we don't want to go down there because there's a possibility that we're going to be in danger. And I think that part is really critical to understand. And it's also helpful as you think about how you sort of treat trauma and stress-related disorders, is that people are approaching this because it was adaptive in some way. There's some benefit to being emotionally amped up. And part of it's about trying to get people not to be as emotionally amped up, to understand that you're no longer in that threatening or dangerous context. You're now in a very safe context, and learning how to accept that, for me personally, has been difficult. There's been, as you mentioned before, a lot of shame, a lot of self-processing that's had to happen. And I think in some ways that's informed a lot of the science that I do and a lot of the science that I've tried to do as we try to incorporate not just what happens to the brain after you go through the traumatic event, but how do you predict what's going to happen in the brain and behaviorally, and how does all of that fit within the context that people live? We talked a little bit earlier about, quite frankly, money would solve a lot of problems when it comes to trying to get therapy. And it turns out, that sort of socio-environmental context, that sort of resource availability of the neighborhoods you live in, that also plays a pretty big role in terms of how likely you are to recover from a traumatic event, how likely you are to just be resilient later on. And it seems to be associated with changes in brain function and structure in the regions that we know are really important for PTSD development.
You kind of touched on this earlier, but I wanted to ask you again, like, how prevalent are ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and PTSD, CPTSD, and those things that result in trauma-related disorders in the United States? How prevalent is that?
It's a really good question. So, when we're talking about traumatic events, we're talking about what we call a DSM criterion A trauma. We're really talking about 90% of the population will have experienced at least one criterion A traumatic event within their lifetime. Most people will experience more than that. In terms of sort of the yearly prevalence, you can look at data from the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control as part of the CDC, and they track the number of individuals that are admitted to emergency rooms every single year. And that number tends to hover somewhere around 28 million individuals who are admitted to the emergency department, which may lead to the level of traumatic event. That's a little bit more than 2 million more than the actual population of Texas. So it's a really large number of individuals who are experiencing a trauma or potential trauma every single year. In terms of adverse childhood experiences, the data that we have from the CDC suggests that it's about 61% of individuals who have experienced at least one ACE, and really about 16 to 20% will have experienced two or more ACEs in their lifetime. And so when we're talking about the preponderance and the prevalence of trauma, it's really high. In terms of their sort of rates of PTSD and CPTSD, this is somewhere between 8% for PTSD and somewhere around 3% for CPTSD, depending on which sort of epidemiological study you're looking at. The conditional rate, however, sort of that transfer of you've experienced trauma to having PTSD is sort of trauma type specific, right? So maybe around 13%-ish for motor vehicle accidents, but that rises to 30 to 50% for sexual violence or serving in the military. So it's very variable, but it's also very, very prevalent. And in terms of like outcomes, I think it's important to remember sort of two things. Number one, if you want to just look at the economic costs of, say, PTSD, that number hovers somewhere around about $200 billion in terms of excess medical cost or productivity loss every single year. The reality is that that doesn't always include long-term costs for adverse childhood experiences. That doesn't include service members of the military. Like, that's purely what we call civilian trauma. And the other flip side of that is it's really easy to put a number on it, but try to remember that every dollar that we're talking about here is an individual person who exists within a family, exists within a community, who has people who are trying to care for them. So if you think about not just the economic cost to our society, but also the emotional cost to the individual and their family and their other community, it's a really big issue, I think, that we're dealing with.
It's huge. I mean, it's astronomical. I mean, that's so much money, and and that's coming off of data. But how many people are experiencing it that aren't collected in that data, right? I mean, it could be, the number could be higher, and yeah. So before I learned about ACEs and things, I was making films based off my life, and writing about childhood experiences that were normalized, and then working with a huge crew of people, right, to bring it to life, actors and, everybody on the, the film crew and all that, and then putting it on the big silver screen in front of huge audiences. Then suddenly people are coming going, dude, your childhood was kind of fucked up.
Sorry, I don't mean to laugh.
No, but I mean, it is funny. And then realizing like, I think trauma is part of this story. This isn't just a ghost story, or this isn't just a story about wanting to know my gangster dad. This is about trauma. And it is kind of surprising to people how much of that I went through, because most people didn't have any idea. Mm-hmm. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to accept that the reality I told myself, the things I used to prop myself up, were sometimes just preventing me from looking at the harder thing underneath the surface.
It's hard at first. It's hard to accept, especially when you've been put in these situations where you have to take control. You have to take full responsibility. It's all on your shoulders to be able to move anything forward. it's hard to accept that like you didn't have control, that there's nothing that you could have possibly done, that there was no avenue, no strategy that you could have taken to deal with your parents or your caregivers or the environment when you were just a child.
There were other things when I was very young that, my mom has told me, that since I was a really little kid, I had sort of symptoms like I was very reactive to loud sounds, and the migraine started, the sleep disturbances. I always had sleep disturbances from, the time I was really young with these dreams, with just not making it through the night. Just, it was terrifying. And I've, come to recognize, well, some of those things are like PTSD symptoms. And, I was pretty young. Is it possible I was exposed to something violent or traumatic that I witnessed as a kid? My dad was a hang around with a notorious biker gang, and I have on record that he used to bungee cord me with bungee cords to the back of his motorcycle and bring me to their clubhouse. Is it possible I witnessed something there? Maybe. I don't remember. Maybe that's where some of those kind of dreams come from for me. If I witnessed something, was processing something, and it was like you said, you're telling yourself a story over and over again, and you knew there was something scary, but your childhood mind couldn't hold on to it, and it kind of elaborated over there. Maybe. But what would have given me PTSD is something that's always been a question on my mind if I hadn't witnessed something like that, and it's made me kind of question, like, I know both my parents had some pretty traumatic things happen to them before they met in their youth. And then when they met, some of those things for my dad kind of came back to haunt their marriage. Some people from his past showed up, and that resulted in some traumatic experiences for both my mom and dad before I was conceived, but then also that was ongoing, when I was in utero. So I guess I'm curious, Nate, like how much can maternal stress during pregnancy influence an infant's brain development? Is that something that can be carried over that way, or even through epigenetics? I'm throwing a lot at you here, I know, but could I have inherited some of these symptoms, these PTSD symptoms, from my own parents' trauma? I guess that's what I'm wondering.
So I think just saying the foundation, when we're talking about epigenetics, we're talking about sort of environmental-ish changes in the genome. So changes in gene expression that don't change the underlying DNA, right? Your underlying genetic blueprint is the same. You're just changing which things are actually expressed or which things are going to be more expressed. And there's good evidence, I think, across animal models now and some sort of cross-sectional evidence in humans to suggest that when individuals encounter stress, it can result in epigenetic changes, and that for subsequent generations, you can detect those epigenetic changes. So a classic example is if you teach mice to fear this sort of tone shock pairing, and you do it and it's aversive enough, you can actually track this happening to subsequent generations up to, I think it's about the third generation in terms of altered behavior and altered epigenetic code. There's really good evidence from Rachel Yehuda's group and others that have studied both Holocaust survivors and the Dutch famine, really showing that there are these potential sort of alterations in epigenetics that might be passed along from parent to offspring. And maybe one mechanism, this sort of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance of trauma. I think, as I mentioned before, I think that's a cool mechanism and might be biologically relevant. I personally am in the camp of, I think this is probably a mechanism for how certain sort of predispositions to PTSD might be passed down. I also think that, transgenerational transmission of trauma is also very easy. As we sort of talked about before, if you have stress, if you have trauma and you haven't dealt with it, it comes out in the way that you behave. And naturally, if your child or your partner or someone else is around you, at some point, they're going to experience these behaviors, and they're going to go through a very similar process of trying to understand, if it's an aversive behavior, how they protect themselves from that aversive behavior, or process it in multiple different ways. And so there are sort of direct ways, behaviorally, verbally, within the household, that you can have this sort of transgenerational transmission. The other question about sort of prenatal influences is the in utero environment matters a lot. The types of stressors, the types of nutrition, the types of experiences that the mother has during development in utero, many of them can cross the placenta and impact sort of both fetal brain, fetal organ development. So for example, we know in highly traumatized Black populations, in these sort of highly traumatized Black samples among Black mothers, you tend to see sort of lower gestational age, lower birth weight, things that we know are tied to neurodevelopmental issues, other types of developmental issues. And so when you have a lot of stress, when you have your not basic needs met, again, you can have impacts into the sort of in utero environment that we know are associated with long-term outcomes. So yeah, I think that prenatal stressors, prenatal trauma can have an impact on the developing child.
If you're always concerned about your needs, how you're going to make, ends meet, I imagine it's kind of like being stuck in, traffic in Boston 24/7. You know what I mean? And that's going to keep you, your stress heightened all the time. What from your perspective, what kind of interventions or policies could help reduce both the individual and societal costs of trauma?
For me, thinking about how to, especially for young children, you alleviate some burden for parents. How do you address sort of economical issues? How do you address sort of the things that they're dealing with that then they take home? I mean, transgenerational transmission of these sort of PTSD-like phenotypes is such a big thing, especially when we're talking about youth. I think we often think about, well, kids are experiencing trauma and we have to treat the kids. That's totally true, and I'm totally on board. But they're getting and experiencing that stress and trauma from someplace. And often they're getting it from parents who, in many ways, I think mean well, but they have their own sort of stressors, their own types of things that they're dealing with. And without the resources to be able to grapple with that, I think as you might be sort of experiencing, I think as many of us have experienced as we've gone to therapy, it's really hard to not then spread that down to our other relationships, down to people that depend on us, and trying to stop that sort of vicious cycle of you experience trauma, you pass it on, and then they have children and they pass it on, is one of the big things, I think, in terms of trying to mitigate these sort of downstream deleterious consequences.
When Dr. Harnett talks about transgenerational transmission of trauma, it kind of reminds me of a curse. Basically, you can be scarred by situations and choices that happened before you were even born. I used to feel pretty cursed growing up myself. It always seemed like as soon as I got my footing, as soon as I let my guard down, something would sucker punch me in the nuts again. Not that my attitude didn't sometimes play a role in my own chaos, but biological factors nobody could see influenced my disposition, and there was really no way to escape those intrusive feelings that got so overwhelming. I felt different from a very early age, haunted, weighed down by something I couldn't see or name. I grew up in the last frontier, back at the turn of the millennia when the wild wave of the North's heyday was just cresting. For decades, Alaska has had some of the highest violent crime stats per capita in the nation. I don't think I know anyone growing up whose life wasn't touched by domestic violence, substance abuse, or sexual assault in some way. If not them, then someone they loved. As beautiful as Alaska is, it carries an equally brutal and unforgiving darkness. I'd wager most people in my circle had 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. Exposure was rampant. So when Dr. Harnett talks about trauma being passed down, how a parent's traumatic event can shape the biology and behavior of their child, it makes me wonder how much major disasters like the Good Friday earthquake in 1964 contributed to Alaska's dysfunction for decades to come. My dad told me he was racing home on his bike for dinner when the quake hit. It had a magnitude of 9.2 and lasted about 5 minutes. The streets rolled like waves. Buildings cracked and collapsed. Homes were swallowed into the ground. The entire village of Tititlik was swept away, displacing an entire tribe. Growing up, my dad had this sixth sense for quakes. He'd feel them before anyone else, like a dog. And you could see his limbic system light up from PTSD with even the smallest shake. My dad was kind of a badass too. And honestly, that earthquake probably wasn't the worst thing he ever lived through. Adversity has a way of making you resilient, but it leaves its marks. And it's not just the big shockers that fuck you up. For a lot of folks in Alaska, the long dark winters whittle you down if you're not careful. The brief season of the midnight sun is always over too soon, and people brace for winter like it's an oncoming siege, hyper-vigilant for termination dust on the mountains, bundling up for the relentless march of snow toward their doors. It takes a special kind of person to live there for a long term, but that chill can creep under the skin of even the most hardened of us when the light fades and the world goes dark. And honestly, whether we admit it or not, I think millennials as a whole were groomed to live this way. Most of our adult lives, we've been bracing against one environmental stressor after another. Y2K, then 9/11, growing up constantly contemplating terror, war, financial crisis, a barrage of apocalyptic fears, climate change and extreme weather, active shooter drills becoming normal. Not to mention the widening gap between stability and collapse that leaves so many of us feeling unmoored. So, while different major collective traumas shape different moments of our generation, I can't help wondering what this level of chronic stress and hypervigilance does to us and to our kids. That's all the time we have for now. But stay tuned. Dr. Harnett will return soon to weigh in on my questions about whether a person's predisposition to PTSD could contribute to the kind of violence we keep seeing. If you feel you or someone you care about may be living with the effects of traumatic stress, you're not alone. Please visit the resource page at crookedpictures.com for more information and support. Until next time, thanks for listening. And now, do something kind for yourself. It's been a bumpy road far too often, and you fucking deserve it.